Just at a very high level, I would say that there are a lot of difficulties, a lot of challenges. We'll talk about all of them in detail. People put words in your mouth and kind of get the reputation as this doom and gloom guy. Jim Vickers is always talking about the end of the world, which I don't. I never use that expression. But I make the point that, despite the difficulties, we don't have to be victims. We're not helpless. We don't have to curl up in a ball. The key is to see it coming. If you can see things coming, you can deal with them accordingly. You can get through them, not only preserve wealth, but actually make money. I always point out the example of Hugo Stinnes. People go, who's that? He was an industrialist in Weimar, Germany in the early 1920s. And he could see the hyperinflation coming long before the middle class, long before anybody else. He went out and borrowed an enormous amount of Reichsmarks, that was the currency at the time, and just bought industrial assets, coal mines, vessels, natural resources, etc. So here comes the hyperinflation. He gives it a little time. He pays back his debts. I would say pennies on the dollar, like a millionth of a penny on the dollar, in other words. But he paid it back. They were sweeping the money down the sewers, but he paid back his debts and kept all the assets. And he became the richest man in Germany. And my German is not very good, but his nickname was the Inflationskönig, which means the inflation king. So there are other stories like it, Joseph Kennedy in the 1929 crash. But here's a guy who lived through the greatest hyperinflation of any modern industrial economy and ended up as the richest man in Germany because he saw it coming and made the right move. So again, we're not helpless. We can do things about it. But the key to empowerment, as I say, is to see it coming. That's where the analysis comes in. And you're like, Jim, are you smarter than everybody else? Of course not. There are a lot of big brains around, but people have flawed models. There's a lot of behavioral psychology behind it. The confirmation bias or believing the future will resemble the past, which it usually does not. And so if you're going to stick to those models, you're going to get really bad results. It's hard to think of an institution that has a worse forecasting record than the Federal Reserve, the U.S. Federal Reserve, with the possible exception of the IMF. They're both pretty bad. I mean, you could almost take the Fed forecast, do the opposite, and be just fine. There's more to it than that, but they just stick to these really bad models. But if you understand how the economy really works, if you understand it's a complex dynamic system, all I've done is I've taken complexity theory, which has been around for a while. I mean, you can say 13 billion years because the Big Bang was the ultimate complex dynamic paradigm shift or a phase transition. But the science of complexity, understood in mathematical terms, really dates to the kind of the early 60s. But it's been used very successfully in physics. It has a lot of applications. All I did was bring it over to capital markets. I looked at capital markets and said, wait a second, here's one of the most complex dynamic systems you can picture. And then there's nothing more complex than the human brain. So you're putting humans on top of capital markets. You've got complexity squared or some exponent. And those models work brilliantly. But try getting anyone to understand it or do that work is difficult. But again, the point is, if you have the right models, and I would include behavioral psychology, a good dose of history, complexity theory, and a few other branches of applied mathematics, you can get very good results. But if you stick to the Phillips curve and non-accelerating inflation, unemployment rate, and a lot of other nonsense the Fed uses, you're gonna get it wrong. Does the future resemble the past with some probability, some degree of distribution of probability? Not always. I mean, and maybe less frequently now than ever. And they also assume that prices move continuously. Prices go up and down, of course, but markets don't move continuously. Or if they do, it's when you don't care. When you do care, they just gap. They gap down or they gap up. You miss it, you blink, and it's at a completely different level. It's been repriced. Now, you can still get in and out, but you've either made a lot of money or lost a lot of money, in the blink of an eye. So when you take those characteristics, and this is how I started kind of deconstructing it, if you will, and say, well, look, markets are not efficient. That's nonsense. They don't move continuously and slowly. They gap up and they gap down. And if you're not ready for that, you've missed the boat. Nothing's risk-free. So why don't we start there? When I started identifying those factors that, in my view, were incorrectly applied, and you say, well, what looks like that? Well, the answer is a complex dynamic system. A system that produces hurricanes and tornadoes and lightning bolts and power outages and earthquakes and tsunamis. Those are all examples of the results of complex dynamic systems. An earthquake doesn't sneak up on you. It just it just, the ground falls out from under you instantly. And that's what happens in markets. So then I said, well, maybe that's a better model. Of course, it is. Things evolve all the time. Another tool, intellectual tool, applied mathematical tool, uses Bayes' theorem without getting too much in the weeds. And I learned Bayes' theorem at the CIA because I always say, if you have all the facts, a smart high school kid can solve the problem. The intelligence agencies and others, people in capital markets, have to solve problems when you don't have all the facts. But you have no choice. In national security or defense, it's literally life or death. On Wall Street, it could be your fortune or your client's fortune. So you don't have the luxury of just throwing up your hands and say, well, I'm going to wait till I get more facts. That's what Janet Yellen did, but that doesn't work in the real world. She's kind of detached from that. So how do you solve problems when you don't have all the facts you need to really solve the problem? And you know it, but you have to deal with it anyway because it's coming at you. Well, Bayes' theorem says assign an initial probability, a priori assumption. Just not make it up, but do the best you can, recognizing that you're going to fall short, that you've got missing pieces in the puzzle, if you want to put it that way. And if you have no facts at all, and it's a binary outcome, give it 50-50. Like, it's like, it's not quite 50-50, but red or black on a roulette table, it's a little less than 50-50. It was close enough. You say, it's either going to be red or black, don't know which. I'm going to give it a 50-50. And then what you do, this is what statisticians hate, you update it based on subsequent facts. As new facts come in, you put them back in the model, you update it, and what you'll discover is that your probability either goes up or down. Well, if it goes down more than a certain amount, you discard it. You say, well, that's wrong. I just do it again. But if it goes up, what you're doing is making it more and more likely that your assumption was true. And so eventually you can get up to the 80-90% level. And that's not 100%, but it's pretty darn good. But there's a tension, which is, okay, as you're updating, and this is something that was explained to me by Henry Kissinger. So imagine a simple graph, and the vertical axis, the y-axis is the probability of a certain outcome, and the x-axis is a timeline. Basically, you convert that into the amount of information you have. How much information do I have? How much time do I have to make a decision? Well, at zero, at the outset, you have no information, or very little. But you have a lot of time. You have a lot of degrees of freedom. But as you move across the x-axis, as you move down the timeline, what you discover is you get more and more information, which is a good thing. So that curve is going up. But you have less and less time, fewer degrees of freedom. That curve is going down. So when you get all the way to the other end, it's like, hey, I have perfect information, but it's too late. It's over. I missed either, war started, or I lost all my money, or something bad happened. So what you look for is the sweet spot in the middle, call it the Kissinger cross, where I have enough information to be smart, but enough time to have degrees of freedom and be able to act. You look for that sweet spot in the middle, and that's when you act. And, with a little humility is a very good tool, a good addition to the formula. So as I say, in the CIA, you never have enough information. You're always trying to get more, but you have to do the best you can, and kind of make assumptions and make forecasts, because you don't have the luxury of sitting back. You can't wait for 10 9/11 events so you can have a good statistical base. You got one, and you want to prevent the next one,